Cleopatra has become one of the most famous names in all of history, remembered as the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. Her name carries an aura of seduction, political cunning, and tragedy. Yet beneath the glamour of Hollywood portrayals and romanticized legends lies a story that is often stranger than fiction. Cleopatra lived in a world where family ties were twisted into something very different from what modern audiences would consider normal. To preserve dynastic power, the Ptolemies frequently married their siblings, creating a cycle of intermarriage that shocked even some of their contemporaries. Cleopatra herself inherited this tradition and became bound to it, making her story not just one of power and politics, but also one of incest, betrayal, and ruthless survival. To understand why Cleopatra was married to her brothers, we must look back to the origins of her family. The Ptolemaic dynasty was not originally Egyptian, but Macedonian Greek. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, one of his generals, Ptolemy, took control after Alexander's death. He and his descendants ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, but unlike many conquerors, they adopted certain Egyptian customs to legitimize their rule. One of those customs was sibling marriage. Egyptian pharaohs, believed to be divine figures, often married their sisters to preserve the purity of the royal bloodline. For the Greeks who settled in Alexandria, this practice seemed shocking and unnatural. Yet for the Egyptians, it was a symbol of legitimacy. The Ptolemies embraced it, even though it clashed with their Greek roots, because it strengthened their claim to be true pharaohs. Over time, this became not only tradition, but also a political strategy, as it prevented royal power from being diluted by outsiders. Cleopatra's own family tree is a perfect example of how tangled these relationships became. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was himself likely the product of such unions, and by the time Cleopatra was born, the dynasty had seen generation after generation of intermarried siblings. This web of incest contributed to physical and mental weaknesses in the royal family, but it also created an environment where betrayal between siblings was common. Brothers and sisters were not simply family members. They were rivals for the throne. Marriage did not guarantee affection or loyalty. In fact, in many cases, it turned brother against sister, husband against wife, and left the palace a place of constant intrigue and bloodshed. When Ptolemy XII died, the throne passed to his daughter Cleopatra, but she was required to share power with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who also became her husband. Cleopatra was about 18 years old at the time, while her brother was only around 10. Their marriage was purely political, orchestrated by palace advisors who sought to maintain the dynastic tradition and ensure that Cleopatra could not rule entirely on her own. But Cleopatra was far more ambitious and intelligent than most of her predecessors. She quickly began to assert herself as the true power in Egypt, much to the resentment of the young king's guardians. The marriage, unsurprisingly, was not one of love or equality. It was a forced partnership that soon descended into open hostility. Cleopatra refused to be a puppet queen, and her brother's advisors plotted to push her out of power. This led to civil war, with Cleopatra in exile and Ptolemy XIII holding Alexandria. The situation escalated until the arrival of Julius Caesar, who entered Egypt in pursuit of Pompey. Cleopatra famously smuggled herself into Caesar's presence, wrapped in a rug, and won his support. With Caesar's backing, she regained her throne, and her brother husband soon met his death, drowning in the Nile during the fighting. But Cleopatra's story with brother husbands did not end there. After the death of Ptolemy XIII, she was married to yet another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, who was only around 12 years old. Again, this marriage had nothing to do with affection. It was a political arrangement meant to preserve appearances. Cleopatra, now allied with Caesar and carrying his child, had little interest in her new husband. Ptolemy XIV was kept in the background, a symbolic figure whose existence reassured the Egyptian court that tradition was being upheld. In reality, Cleopatra was the sole ruler, supported by her Roman ally. Eventually, When Caesar was assassinated in Rome, Cleopatra saw her young brother husband as a potential threat. To secure her own position and her son's future, she had Ptolemy XIV killed, clearing the way for her child, Caesarion, to be named co-ruler. These tangled relationships with her brothers reveal just how dark and ruthless the politics of the Ptolemaic dynasty were. Cleopatra, remembered today as a seductive queen, was in fact shaped by this world of incest and betrayal. To survive, she had to navigate a palace where even her closest relatives could not be trusted, where marriage meant nothing more than a fragile alliance, and where every decision could mean life or death. The fact that she emerged as one of the most powerful and enduring figures of the ancient world is a testament not only to her intelligence and charm, but also to her ability to outwit and outlast a dynasty built on corruption, manipulation, and disturbing traditions. Cleopatra's rise to power and her unusual marriages cannot be understood without looking closely at the family culture she grew up in. The Ptolemaic court was a theater of cruelty, where assassinations and betrayals were not shocking but expected. Cleopatra's siblings were both her partners and her enemies, and the throne was always a prize to be fought over. Her brother husbands were not meant to be true companions in her life. They were pawns in a deadly game where tradition demanded union, but ambition demanded rivalry. In many ways, these so-called marriages served as the mask of legitimacy, while behind the scenes, Cleopatra maneuvered with skill and ruthlessness to secure her survival. It was less about the intimacy of marriage and more about who controlled Egypt's vast wealth and its strategic place in the Mediterranean world. What makes Cleopatra's story even more fascinating is how she managed to turn a system that was designed to suppress her into an opportunity for power. Women in the Ptolemaic dynasty could be rulers, but they were usually overshadowed by their male co-rulers. Cleopatra refused to accept that limitation. Even though she was officially bound to her brothers, she consistently pushed them aside, ensuring that she alone held the true authority. Her brilliance lay in her ability to balance tradition with innovation. On the one hand, she upheld the sacred image of sibling marriage to present herself as a proper pharaoh in the eyes of the Egyptians. On the other hand, she reached beyond her family to form alliances with the most powerful men of Rome, effectively bypassing the dynastic weakness of her own household. This dual strategy of honoring the facade of tradition while secretly undermining it is what allowed Cleopatra to carve her place in history. The way she dealt with her brother Ptolemy XIV demonstrates her cold political instincts. Though he was technically her husband and co-ruler, he was still a threat to her son's inheritance. Cleopatra had no intention of sharing power with a weak child king once Caesarion was born. Eliminating her brother was not an act of cruelty for cruelty's sake, but a calculated move to remove an obstacle from her path. This was a pattern repeated throughout her dynasty's history. Brothers killing sisters, sisters poisoning brothers, mothers betraying their own children. Cleopatra was merely continuing a tradition of bloodshed, though she perfected it with a precision and clarity of purpose that made her stand out. She had learned from watching the failures of her father and ancestors that hesitation meant death. In such a world, survival itself required actions that modern readers might find shocking or immoral. At the same time, it is important to understand that Cleopatra was not merely a victim of circumstance or a heartless schemer. She was also a product of two very different cultures colliding. As a Ptolemy, she was Macedonian Greek, carrying the legacy of Alexander the Great's generals. But as a pharaoh, she was also Egyptian, expected to embody the traditions of the Nile Valley that stretched back thousands of years. This cultural duality shaped her identity and forced her to navigate a tightrope between worlds. Marrying her brothers was part of her Egyptian role, a ritual of divine kingship. Aligning with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony was part of her Greek and Roman side, where political alliances were the true key to power. Cleopatra's genius was that she managed to combine these roles, presenting herself as a goddess in Egypt while acting as a shrewd stateswoman in dealings with Rome. The perception of Cleopatra as scandalous or even perverse often comes from Roman propaganda. The Romans loved to portray her as a dangerous temptress who corrupted noble men with her charms. Her brother marriages were used as proof of her decadence, reinforcing stereotypes about Eastern rulers indulging in practices that Romans found abhorrent. But the truth was more complex. Incestuous marriages were not Cleopatra's invention, but a system she inherited, one that she manipulated to her advantage. What shocked Roman writers was not simply the marriages themselves, but the fact that Cleopatra used them to consolidate her power rather than being controlled by them. To Roman eyes, she was a woman who dared to rule in her own right, and that was perhaps more scandalous than her marriages ever were. Nevertheless, there is no denying the unsettling reality of the world she lived in. For modern audiences, the idea of marrying siblings is disturbing, and Cleopatra's involvement in such unions makes her story both fascinating and grotesque. It paints a picture of a dynasty that had twisted itself into knots, where power was valued above family bonds, and where even the most intimate relationships were consumed by politics. Cleopatra's ability to thrive in this environment is what has made her so legendary. But it also highlights just how abnormal her world was compared to the values we hold today. She was both a queen and a survivor of one of history's most dysfunctional royal families, a woman who played the game better than anyone else and left behind a legacy that still captures the imagination. Cleopatra's reputation as one of history's most infamous rulers rests not only on her political alliances with Rome, but also on the extraordinary circumstances of her family life. To understand how deeply unusual her dynasty was, it is worth considering the broader context of the Ptolemaic household. Unlike most monarchies, where marriages were used to build alliances with other nations, the Ptolemies consistently turned inward. Instead of forging ties with foreign kings, they chose to marry their brothers and sisters. This policy insulated them from outside influence, but also isolated them, locking them into a cycle of rivalry and bloodshed. By Cleopatra's time, this practice had become so entrenched that her marrying her younger brothers was not a matter of choice, but an expectation. What made Cleopatra unique was how she transformed this suffocating tradition into a stage for her own ambitions. The period of her marriage to Ptolemy XIII reveals much about her resilience and cunning. Although officially his wife, she treated the marriage as a hollow ritual, focusing instead on consolidating power through her intelligence, charisma, and political skill. When civil war broke out, she did not hesitate to seek outside support. Cleopatra understood that the strength of Egypt alone would not secure her position against palace factions determined to remove her. Her famous meeting with Julius Caesar was therefore not just a romantic episode, as later writers would have it, but a master stroke of political theater. By presenting herself directly to Caesar, bypassing all protocol, she captured his attention and secured his protection. Without that daring move, her brother husband's faction might have succeeded in destroying her. Instead, she returned to Alexandria with Caesar at her side, re-established her rule, and saw her brother perish in defeat. Her subsequent marriage to Ptolemy XIV was no less hollow. At just 12 years old, he could not pose a serious challenge to Cleopatra's authority, but his existence was politically useful. The Egyptian court and the priesthood needed to see continuity. A queen joined with a king, even if that king was merely a boy. Cleopatra allowed the charade to continue while she focused on her relationship with Caesar, which offered real security. It is telling that she later had her young brother eliminated once Caesar was dead. With no powerful Roman ally to protect her, Cleopatra could not risk leaving potential rivals alive. Her decision to remove Ptolemy XIV cleared the way for Caesarion, her son by Caesar, to stand beside her as co-ruler. In her world, family ties mattered less than survival, and the crown demanded sacrifices, even if those sacrifices were her own kin. The scandal of these marriages has often overshadowed Cleopatra's actual achievements. She was a capable ruler who spoke several languages, reformed aspects of Egypt's administration, and maintained the country's independence during an era when Rome was swallowing up territories across the Mediterranean. Her personal life, twisted though it may seem to modern audiences, was inseparable from her political strategy. Every brother she married, every rival she outmaneuvered, was part of her larger goal of keeping Egypt powerful and secure. In this sense, the marriages were less about passion or family and more about survival in a hostile and unforgiving system. Cleopatra understood the symbolic weight of tradition, but refused to let it define her limits. By embracing it outwardly while undermining it privately, she mastered the game her ancestors had created. What is striking about Cleopatra's story is how often she is remembered for the sensational elements, the incestuous marriages, the affairs with Caesar and Mark Antony, the dramatic suicides, rather than the pragmatic choices behind them. When stripped of moral judgment, her actions reveal a woman who was adapting to impossible circumstances with remarkable skill. In a dynasty where hesitation often meant death, Cleopatra not only survived, but reigned longer and more effectively than most of her predecessors. Her story challenges us to see beyond the lurid details and recognize the intelligence and resolve that lay beneath. Yet it is undeniable that the grotesque customs of her family shaped her destiny. Without the framework of sibling marriage, without the blood-stained rivalries of her dynasty, she might never have become the Cleopatra we know today, the queen who symbolized both decadence and power, both scandal and greatness. The very fact that she could take such a disturbing tradition and turn it into an instrument of strength explains why Cleopatra remains endlessly fascinating. Her world was one where love and family bonds were sacrificed on the altar of political necessity. To survive, she married children, warred against brothers, bore a son to a foreign conqueror, and played the role of divine goddess to her people. In this strange intersection of politics, tradition, and survival, she carved out one of the most unforgettable legacies in world history. Her story forces us to confront the darker side of dynastic power, the willingness to bend even the most sacred bonds of family into tools of control, and to recognize how a single individual could navigate such a world with brilliance and brutality alike. Cleopatra's relationships with her brother husbands were only the beginning of the extraordinary and scandalous story that defined her reign. Once Caesar was gone, she faced the monumental challenge of keeping Egypt independent in a world increasingly dominated by Rome. At this point, her strategy shifted from survival against her siblings to survival against the greatest empire of her time. Yet the lessons she had learned from growing up in a family where betrayal was constant prepared her well. She knew how to manipulate appearances, when to strike, and when to retreat. These instincts, sharpened in the poisonous atmosphere of the Ptolemaic court, became the tools she used to navigate her alliances with Rome's most powerful men. After Caesar's death, Cleopatra aligned herself with Mark Antony, another Roman leader whose power seemed capable of securing Egypt's future. Their relationship has often been romanticized as a great love affair, but much like her marriages to her brothers, it was rooted in politics. Cleopatra saw Antony as her best chance to maintain control and protect her son Caesarion's position. She provided him with wealth and resources, while Antony offered military strength and legitimacy in the broader Roman world. To the Egyptians, Cleopatra presented herself as Isis reborn, a divine queen joined with a heroic protector. To the Romans, however, she became a symbol of corruption, the foreign queen who lured one of their own into decadence and ruin. The propaganda war against her, launched by Octavian, turned Cleopatra into the embodiment of Eastern excess, reinforcing the image of her as a woman who blurred the boundaries between family, sexuality, and power. The irony is that much of this Roman propaganda built upon the truth of her family's traditions. The stories of her sibling marriages were easy weapons to use against her, proof in Roman eyes that she was morally depraved and unfit to rule. Octavian painted her not just as a foreign queen, but as a perverse threat to Roman values, one who could undermine their leaders with her beauty and cunning. Cleopatra, of course, was playing a different game. To her, these marriages had been tools, masks she wore to satisfy Egyptian expectations while she pursued her real goals through Roman alliances. The Romans chose to focus on the sensational elements, twisting them into a narrative that justified war. In the end, this propaganda was devastatingly effective, ensuring that Cleopatra's name would forever be linked not just with power, but with scandal. The collapse of her alliance with Antony and the defeat at Actium marked the final chapter of her extraordinary life. Faced with Octavian's advance and the inevitability of defeat, Cleopatra once again turned to the survival strategies she had honed since her youth. She attempted to negotiate directly with Octavian, offering her throne, her wealth, and even her own hand in marriage in exchange for the preservation of her children's lives. But this time, her charm and cunning failed. Octavian had no intention of allowing her line to survive, especially not Caesarion, the son of Julius Caesar, who could one day challenge Rome's supremacy. Surrounded by betrayal and with no way out, Cleopatra chose the path of defiance. Her suicide, whether by aspi bite or poison, was her final act of control, denying Octavian the satisfaction of parading her as a captive in Rome. Looking back, Cleopatra's life is both horrifying and awe-inspiring. She lived in a dynasty where incest was normalized, where marriage meant nothing more than a fragile political agreement, and where family ties were repeatedly broken by ambition. She turned these circumstances into opportunities, outmaneuvering brothers, advisors, and rivals to stand as one of the most powerful rulers of her time. Her intelligence, linguistic skill, and ability to adapt made her a formidable figure. Yet her story was twisted by enemies into one of seduction and scandal. Even centuries later, the image of Cleopatra as a dangerous temptress lingers, overshadowing her achievements as a ruler who preserved Egypt's independence for nearly 2 decades in the face of Roman expansion. The truth is that Cleopatra was neither merely a seductress nor a saint. She was a queen who understood the brutal reality of power, shaped by a family system that forced her into marriages with her own brothers and into battles against her own blood. She learned to survive in a world where betrayal was constant and where even love was a political act. Her legacy is a reminder of how distorted and cruel dynastic politics could become, but also of how one extraordinary woman could rise above them to leave a mark on history that still endures. When we remember Cleopatra as the queen who married her brothers, we should not only see scandal, but also the story of a survivor who turned the strangest and darkest traditions of her dynasty into stepping stones toward greatness.